The Metal Gear series was important for the medium. In this video, we'll be looking at how Hideo Kojima's signature franchise developed, moving from its origins on the MSX in 1987 to the final Metal Gear Solid, 2015's The Phantom Pain. The West's introduction to Metal Gear was on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1988. But Metal Gear was designed specifically for the MSX computer platform in 1987. Development was led by a 24-year-old rookie under Konami named Hideo Kojima. Metal Gear, said Kojima in 2005, originated from orders to more or less knock off Capcom's arcade hit Commando as a game for the MSX. For a time, it used the working title Intruder. The MSX2 was outdated. It was no match for any modern arcade cabinet in 1987. As a result, the entire design for Metal Gear stemmed from inherent technical limitations with the MSX itself. Quote, "Only two enemies could be on the screen at once, while too much action would cause the game to crash. To overcome this obstacle, Kojima, using the Great Escape as a source of influence, required players to sneak around the enemy while avoiding combat, if possible. Instead of direct combat, players needed to hide. This technological limitation gave birth to what is now known as the stealth genre." End quote. 8bitdigi.com. Getting spotted outside of boss fights in Metal Gear triggers what's called an alert phase. To quote from the Metal Gear wiki, if the player is seen and only a single exclamation mark appears over an enemy's head, only the enemies in the player's present screen will attack, and an escape can be made by moving to the adjacent screen. But if two exclamation marks appear over the enemy, or the player triggers an alarm by being spotted by a camera, infrared sensor, or by using an unsilenced weapon, reinforcements from off-screen will appear as well. The player can only escape by eliminating enemies until reinforcements stop, by moving to a different floor or building, or entering a boss fight room. End quote. This means getting spotted unconsciously steers the player to run and hide instead of standing your ground, which would be more typical in a video game. This was the way that Kojima worked around the MSX. Showing lots of action was fatal for the machine, so to speak, so Kojima's team made it fatal for the player, too, as an integral part of the gameplay. What makes the Metal Gear game so entertaining is the ebb and flow, the rhythm between combat and stealth. Kojima has said a major influence on the mechanics of Metal Gear as a stealth game was hide and seek, or as it's known in Japan, grab the Oni by the tail. There are more than just enemy sentries to look out for. Metal Gear is known for its surveillance cameras, tripwires, electronic sensors, and other high-tech, even sci-fi gizmos. You progress in Metal Gear by finding higher clearance level keycards, which unlock new areas. In fact, everything in the game, from weapons to items, you'll first have to procure on site. Keycards unlock weapons and new areas, which in turn unlock new boss fights and puzzles. Snake's firepower, meanwhile, grows. You go from a defenseless shadow to a walking arsenal capable of taking on not just human targets, but also helicopters and tanks. In Metal Gear, Snake must face down the world's greatest mercenaries and assassins across a host of environments and scenarios. And that's what gives even the earliest Metal Gear a sublime sense of balance. The sneaking is tempered by tense, high-speed boss confrontations, and these require violating every instinct for stealth that you've spent the game honing with weapons like the grenade launcher and the submachine gun. And whether it's in the field or against a boss, gameplay changes in Metal Gear happen fast. As Snake, you'll need to adapt to any situation on the fly. You never completely know what's around the corner. One example, in a direct nod to the aforementioned Steve McQueen movie, The Great Escape, there's a section in Metal Gear where you're abruptly taken prisoner. Snake has to find his way out of the prison while avoiding the guard dogs. Meanwhile, each boss battle in Metal Gear requires a different weapon or strategy. This ends up giving a lot of variety over time. As original and well-suited as Metal Gear was for the MSX, the English-speaking world got a very different version on the NES. only about half of the original game's radio calls made it over. What's worse, according to Jeremy Blaustein, chief localizer for 1998's Metal Gear Solid, during the late 80s, basically Western advertisers were free to rewrite games on a whim. Konami were particularly careless with Metal Gear. Not only were silly English names allowed in, like Colonel Katafi, the port's box art is infamous today for lifting its image of Snake straight from the 1984 James Cameron film The Terminator. Simply put, the NES version of Metal Gear is inferior in every way. The West would not see a true Hideo Kojima game released here until 1998's Metal Gear Solid. Unless, of course, you count the 1994 port of Snatcher for the Sega CD, a console that was so expensive that few people in the West ever played it. From the underwater infiltration at the beginning to the rooftop hind boss battle, even the titular giant robot itself, Metal Gear, none of it survived cross-platform translation. So what happened from the MSX to the NES? According to Hideo Kojima, Konami simply gave the source code to another team entirely without Kojima's team's consent or input. Speaking to Hardcore Gaming 101 by way of Wikipedia, Masahiro Ueno, who worked as a programmer for the NES version, said, "The staff who worked on Metal Gear 1988 were given a 3-month deadline and were ordered by Konami executives to make the port as different as possible from the MSX2 version. Due to hardware limitations with the mapper used, the Metal Gear boss ended up being replaced by a supercomputer guarded by 4 enemy soldiers." End quote. The NES port of Metal Gear was so bad that it would later be publicly disowned by Hideo Kojima. As bad as Metal Gear on the NES proved to be, though, Konami's biggest insult for the era would have to be Snake's Revenge, a Western-only follow-up commissioned behind Kojima's back. Learning of the existence of Snake's Revenge led Kojima to personally request a chance to develop his own sequel, strictly for Japan. Konami relented. 1990's Metal Gear 2, Sorido Seneku, was the result. Solid Snake was a major improvement on the already excellent original. In Metal Gear 1987, guards stuck to a given subsection, but in Metal Gear 2, their patrols moved them across subsections, and with their field of vision increased to 45 degrees, the enemy now had to be closely observed and their route well remembered. Solid Snake uses a top-down camera, and a given area is broken down into 3x3 size subsections. This allows the level design to work with the radar, and in turn with gameplay. Alerts will knock out your radar, giving a subtle element of information warfare to the enemy's countermeasures against you. Metal Gear 2 also introduced enemy sensitivity to sounds like walking on grates and punching the wall. This brought a sense of presence to the environment that would soon become a major feature for the series at large. Meanwhile, Snake gained the ability to crawl on all fours and crouch. This meant more environmental hiding spots than the first game. The map of Metal Gear 2, Zanzibar Land, offered a unique blend of urban, jungle, and swamp environments. The player moves not only up the many floors inside the enemy base, but also down the drainage channels, around the marshes, and over the squeaking desert sands. This original run of games on the MSX, not on the NES, would serve as the foundation for Metal Gear Solid in 1998, arguably one of the most important game releases in history.
Heavily armed soldiers occupied Shadow Moses Island, a remote island off the coast of Alaska.
Like its MSX ancestors, Metal Gear Solid, which debuted on the Sony PlayStation, is about infiltrating an enemy base. But what can't be understated is how revolutionarily it took Metal Gear, and gaming generally, into the third dimension. One of several explanations behind the name Metal Gear Solid has to do with solid shapes, polygons. 3D, in other words. Driven by the general concept of a playable movie, Metal Gear Solid builds its world and immerses its player through seamless and dynamic real-time mechanics. However, your general objectives remain the same as ever. get to the next area undetected or at the very least, still breathing. Unlock new areas, items, and weapons using keycards of increasing clearance level. Defeat bosses and rescue hostages. Ultimately, stop the enemy's planned nuclear attacks. As much as MGS1 is a faithful reinvention of the MSX era for the series, we should mention another major influence, the much-beloved Nintendo series Super Mario Bros. Like in Mario games, Metal Gear games are about problem-solving and gameplay variety. Like your typical Mario level, in MGS1 there are a set number of enemies moving along a set route. There will also inevitably be environmental obstacles, including these literal Mario-esque pitfalls. Mario levels can be completed in a number of forms. In the same way, the specifics of how you overcome obstacles in MGS1 are frequently left up to you. Both Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake and MGS1 feature strong verticality, a sense of moving not only from point to point, but also up high and way down low. The environmental diversity gives the game a sense of being its own little world, much in the way that Mario games blew players' minds in the 80s by sending them not only across one terrain, but also underwater, into the air, and across different climates. But one major difference is that in the Nintendo series of platformers, there's often very little time to think before acting. In Metal Gear, on the other hand, slow and methodical observation of the enemy allows, if not requires, planning in advance. The Sony PlayStation allowed MGS1 something like first-person mode, although Snake can't really move and shoot at the same time. And while this feels pretty dated today, it's important to note that this limitation also serves the purpose of emphasizing that this is a game about spying. It's a reconnaissance mode. First person in MGS1, in other words, is for gathering intel. There's a subtle aim lock feature, which means getting close enough to your target with the basic handgun, Snake's .45 caliber SOCOM, is enough to hit them relatively accurately. So you don't necessarily need first person for shooting. Especially since there's this, the Nikita remote missile, which was pretty cutting edge in 1998. It allows missile guidance from first person. In some respects, this was more fun, or at least more unique, than a simple first person shooter mechanic might have been. In MGS1, the weapons all do more than simply cause the enemy more damage. This game was a very early attempt, I'd argue, at something akin to Dark Souls from today, in the sense that each weapon requires a certain finesse, a certain way of handling. This went back to the MSX era, and some of its weapons like the Stinger missile launcher, but the addition of a third dimension only increased the different styles and types of gameplay when it came to weapons. And though puzzle sequences like this electrified floor usually only have one solution, in this case using the Nikita to hit this terminal on the wall, the boss battles in MGS1 usually have at least two ways to approach them. And that frees up the player for a bit of open-ended gameplay. The weapons you wind up picking can feel, as a result, like an extension of you, something you personally are contributing to the gameplay. The best example of this is in the Cyborg Ninja fight. You can defeat him with the electronic scrambling chaff grenade, or take him down with what the Metal Gear universe calls CQC, close quarters combat. And the decision that you make has implications for the story as much as for the gameplay. Demonstrating that in Metal Gear Solid, unlike the MSX Metal Gear games, it's not always easy to distinguish between the two. Revolver Ocelot, the sadistic Spetsnaz cowboy, for example, can be taken down Wild West style with only a sidearm. Or you can go the route of stun grenades in C4. And there's a lot of fun in experimenting with different weapons and items in MGS1's boss battles, for the most part. However, the game was built for the D-pad, not for an analog stick. That makes playing MGS1 today kind of difficult if you aren't well versed in the D-pad era. But if you do pick it up today, you'll find an unusual focus for the era, not on graphics, but atmosphere, immersion, and a complete devotion to the use of rendering in real time. In this scenario, for example, the extreme Alaskan cold has frozen shut a door, which forces Snake to reroute on the fly. Or in this scenario, a certain keycard has to be exposed to 3 different levels of heat to change form.
Snake, it looks like you changed the card key's shape correctly. Go and put it into the middle terminal in the control room before it warms up and changes back to its original shape.
The emphasis on a physical world would be an important constant in the MGS games to come. There may seem to be somewhat less environmental variety in MGS1 compared to, say, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, given almost all of it happens indoors. But the variety and complexity of the level design in MGS1 has actually increased for the series on the PlayStation. But using the environment and level design as a function of gameplay would evolve with MGS1 into a major selling point for the series as a whole. This is another sense of the meaning of solid. MGS1 roots itself in a pseudo-physical solid space. You climb, traverse, and crawl around Shadow Moses like Mario bouncing around a typical level. It's not a platformer, however, but an action game. Your survival in MGS1, in other words, isn't contingent on movement, or even on weapons alone, but on resource conservation and max health. And here we need to mention another key Nintendo relative of MGS as a series, Legend of Zelda. You start out in Zelda games with a meager 3 hearts. You gain more by beating bosses and finding heart pieces. Along the way, you obtain all the necessary items. There may be no heart pieces, but Metal Gear adopts the same approach to health and weapons broadly as the Zelda series, especially in the sense that it restricts access to certain areas until you have acquired the right item or weapon. Again, borrowing from Zelda, each boss in Metal Gear Solid, not to mention each new game scenario generally, usually requires using a new item. In the MSX era, the enemy base was laid out sensibly. You had the mess hall, the bathroom, the drainage channel, and so on. A lot of thought went into the pragmatic essentials, so these areas felt like they were more than mere set dressing. Everything had its purpose. And this even affected gameplay. Each facility in Metal Gear 2, for example, is linked by shipping routes that Snake can exploit. Disguised as a box, you can engage in a rudimentary form of fast travel, as a stowaway. When Metal Gear Solid entered development in the 1990s, the norm was CGI, pre-rendered so-called cutscenes, as far as narrative-heavy PS1 games went. For Hideo Kojima, the problem was that jumping between pre-rendered to real-time rendered scenes made the overall visuals inconsistent. For the most part, everything in 3D that you see in 1998's Metal Gear Solid renders in-game, and in real time. This was part of a broader design philosophy that I talk about at length in Existence that Hideo Kojima dubbed Digital Fusion. To put it briefly here, Digital Fusion envisioned a seamlessness to the production values that pre-rendered CGI could not deliver. The perfect blend of the interactive and the cinematic. In pursuit of this Digital Fusion, a lot of MGS1 is designed around the use of real-time 3D. The use of Lego sets, mech models, and other objects gave MGS1 a sense of being rooted in a hyper-real, if not altogether realistic world. But the series' pursuit of hyper-realism would begin to enter its zenith only with 2001's Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. As far back as Policenauts in the early 90s, Hideo Kojima was trying to formally integrate Hollywood techniques and gaming. MGS2 not only adopted the style and production values of a Hollywood blockbuster sequel, it served as a comment on Hollywood storytelling at large. Drawing inspiration heavily from 1997's LA Confidential, MGS2 achieved this meta-cinematic commentary through gameplay and technical design as much as through dialogue and story sequences. Notably, the making-of featurette about MGS2 bears the subtitle Making the Hollywood Game. MGS2 would recreate near shot-for-shot sequences from such films as James Cameron's 1997 smash hit Titanic, and include a scenario lifted straight from the wellspring of all things MGS, John Carpenter's Escape from New York. Two main characters bear the names Jack and Rose, while another calls himself Pliskin. Key to this focus on Hollywood artifice was the jump forward in fidelity offered by the PS2, as well as the focus on world building and environmental storytelling by the dev team. During MGS1, Sony had developed a proprietary micro-camera for Kojima to use with his LEGO model sets. This had led to the game's first-person camera mode. To understand its influence on Sons of Liberty, remember that the PS2 was itself something of a sequel. The PS2 still used components from the original console. The original PlayStation's CPU had been repurposed as the PS2's I/O processor, which not only allowed CD reading, but backwards compatibility with PS1 games. Furthermore, the PS2's design largely followed in the original's lead. The first PlayStation had chained together its CPU with a co-processor, the Geometry Transform Engine, or GTE. Utilizing a very large-scale integration chip, or VLSI, custom-made by Sony legend Ken Kutaragi, the PlayStation's CPU had relied on the GTE for vector graphics and high-speed mathematical calculations. The PlayStation 2's CPU, the so-called Emotion Engine, or EE, which a character in MGS2 would take their name from, worked by integrating with not one, but two ancillary vector graphics processing units, known as VPU-0 and VPU-1. That's not even mentioning the PS2's specialized graphics synthesizer and other under-the-hood gizmos that were necessary for its magic with polygons and lighting effects. The PS2 was like the PS1 but only further evolved, bigger and better. In other words, the perfect sequel. Given the horsepower of this new console, many of the first PS2 games following the trends of the former era utilized pre-rendered CGI cutscenes. This maximized the visual fidelity far beyond what was possible in real time. Final Fantasy X, for example, set the bar for pre-rendered facial animations and motion capture when it debuted in July 2001. But Hideo Kojima had already made a hard break from pre-rendered CGI with MGS1. This insistence on real-time 3D would remain. Thanks to the PS2, now character models in Metal Gear moved their lips. The game used lengthy cutscenes, occasionally punctuated by codec calls, as well as stylized illustrated sections known within the dev team colloquially as Shinkawa Theater. Shinkawa Theater scenes are reminiscent of back in MGS1 when the codec employed 2D manga-style depictions of each character. These helped you imagine what the far less detailed and expressionless in-game models were supposed to look like. MGS2 unifies in-game scenes with codec ones, employing full 3D in both. And unlike the MGS1 codec character designs, the Shinkawa Theater sections of MGS2 showcase the art director's signature liquid shadow aesthetic. What can't be overstated is how elegant, artsy, and downright philosophical MGS2 was, particularly for a supposed action game. Certain purists of the genre couldn't believe that MGS2 could be completed without killing a single enemy. For all the hype and controversy surrounding the game's plot, at the end of the day MGS2 earned its narrative strangeness by way of its excellent and watertight game design. In Sons of Liberty, the codec often gets used as a screen within the screen, displaying special context-sensitive video clips. These are actually pre-rendered, but they don't exceed what's capable in-game. That way, there's still no gap. Everything in MGS2 remains seamless and therefore elegant. But given everything in MGS as a rule must be rendered in real time, more or less, there's more to consider than character models and facial animations. Taking yet another experimental risk, Kojima and KCE Japan with MGS2 decided to prioritize environment and overall atmosphere as opposed to detailed expressions or character models. The characters in Sons of Liberty are relatively low poly when compared to the environments. But this made the overall look of the game, the overall aesthetic, far more cohesive and stunningly beautiful. Scenic vistas of the Hudson Bay in MGS2 and the use of real-time weather and day-night effects lend a sense of a real environment. Meanwhile, every different area in this game is unique. That was in of itself revolutionary. In the Big Shell facility, for example, though each uses a nearly identical exterior shape, inside each of these nodes within the facility, you find an extremely specialized environment. We could even compare the way the Big Shell is put together to the architecture of the PS2 itself. MGS2 features native support for the DualShock 2. Both analog sticks have functionality this time around. But the right stick is rather idiosyncratic in Sons of Liberty. You use it to look around from behind cover, rather than the typical 360 degrees of camera mobility that you might expect. Part of the Metal Gear approach to being cinematic at this stage borrowed from an early rival, the original Biohazard, aka Resident Evil. That game used static camera angles, which controlled what the player could see and how they interacted with the environment exactly like a cinematographer might. In the same vein, MGS2 uses predetermined camera angles for the most part. There is no free camera control feature outside first person, and even first person sometimes has limited range. The left stick, meanwhile, gives Snake and the series newcomer Raiden degrees of precision prior titles in the series sorely lacked. Like MGS1, Sons of Liberty uses a sticky wall mechanic. By sidling flat against a surface, your character can observe the adjacent room from a secure location and a better angle. The camera will automatically reorient when entering cover. This is how those cinematic, predefined camera angles dovetailed with the stealth gameplay. In MGS1, pressing L2 or R2 in first-person mode could be used to peek around corners. MGS2 combines some of these controls so that R2 and L2, if pressed at a corner, makes your character peek out. And if you press the fire button from cover, now Snake or Raiden will pop out, fire, and return back to safety. This brings up another idiosyncratic element to the controls in Sons of Liberty: button sensitivity. Holding square raises your gun. Releasing the button puts the gun away, while pressing the button at that point causes the gun to fire. Whether it's fired or put down depends on input pressure. It's a very light and sensitive distinction. Meanwhile, the action button, triangle, can activate MGS2's hanging mode. You can move about the level like never before, by hanging, rolling, and ducking into lockers. Holding L1 and square at the same time lets you move with your gun drawn. This allows rough and ready running and gunning if times get tough. All these changes to the controls made MGS2 much better as an action game. They also made the environment and surveying that environment in first person more central to the gameplay. Taking the series into first-person aiming territory triggered numerous overhauls to other mechanics. Several of the puzzles in MGS2 require using first-person mode extensively, from bomb disposal to target shots.
You're carrying a PSG-1, aren't you? Yeah. It's time to play sniper.
To having to recon a new area prior to unlocking radar capabilities there. The same goes for most of the boss battles. The first one, for example, is all about precise shooting. But the impact of first-person controls extended to alerts and sentries as well. In MGS2, for the first time, the sentries use radios and move and think even as a unit. Target one before engagement and you'll cut them off. The enemy won't be able to report in. On the other hand, some sentries have to make regular reports. Someone will investigate should these stop.
Communications with Strut F have ceased. Carry out an investigation immediately.
Ultimately, there are lots of incentives in MGS2 to avoid confronting the enemy altogether. This balances out the inclusion of first-person aiming. If any clues of your presence are detected, the enemy in MGS2 enters caution mode, something which began in the series with Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Caution mode puts the enemy on high alert and there may be additional sentries posted. If you really piss them off, you may have to endure in MGS2 what's called a clearing. And this is actually modeled on the real tactics that are used by commando teams like SWAT. In order to convey its new features, MGS2 begins at night during a rainstorm. Subtly, this ensured that players would become familiar with the changes before tackling the central campaign head-on. Sons of Liberty introduces in this opening a series staple, the tranquilizer gun. Reprising your role as Snake in the opening chapter, you use the tranq gun to get down first-person shooting fundamentals before the exam, so to speak, of the boss fight with Olga. This also showcases MGS2's overall emphasis on precision. How quickly a guard falls depends on where your dart hits them. The tanker chapter also allows you familiarity with another new mechanic, hold-ups.
Freeze.
With hold-ups, for the first time, the player and the enemy could somewhat interact. Hold-ups not only yield items and ammo, every single guard in MGS2 has a unique dog tag, and hold-ups are how you obtain them. This continued a focus from MGS1 on humanizing the enemy. In MGS2, a sentry's limbs can be broken, blood spurts and spews. But the attention to detail equally applies to physical objects as human beings. Each of these glasses, for example, is combustible as a separate object. This degree of environmental realism and attention to detail was unprecedented in 2001, apart perhaps from Yu Suzuki's Shenmue series. And the gameplay itself would reflect this heightened emphasis on environment, specificity, and atmosphere. There's a bomb disposal section where you use a scent detector. It maps a cloud field. Your job, using first person, is figuring out where within that cloud a bomb has been concealed. This involves looking not only left and right, but up and down. MGS2 utilizes a lot of verticality. Given the design of the many connecting bridges in MGS2's plant chapter, as series newcomer Raiden, you'll spend lots of time hanging, dodging, and cartwheeling. There's an extended sequence underwater and another sequence involving escort duty. In all the scenarios in Sons of Liberty, you'll have to rely on first-person observation more than radar alone. This helps balance out what can sometimes feel like the near omniscience that radar provides.
So, any codec moments from you, Snake? The first image is... Okay, that's good. The shot from the right is in the bag.
As much as MGS2 requires actively using sight, hearing is no less important or involved. A different bomb sensor in the game, for example, will beep the closer you are to the explosive. The biggest set piece involving sound in MGS2 comes during this sequence. Disguised as the enemy, Raiden has to identify someone by the presence of a pacemaker in their chest.
Once you recognize Ames by his heartbeat, keep the microphone pointed toward him.
MGS2 was about not only environment and physical spaces or objects, but also subjective, psychological, first-hand experiences within them. In fact, much of the game is designed to unconsciously echo a memory of the previous title. This is a major part of how MGS2 comments on the expectations for a Hollywoodized sequel.
Colonel, I remember this place.
Of course you do. This is level 1 from the VR missions.
You're right. I see it now.
You may not have field experience, but you've been trained in the hyper-reality of simulated combat. Don't give in to fear. Just do as you were trained and everything will be all right.
Echoing previous games is something that many successful series do, but in Metal Gear Solid 2 it's more than a simple Easter egg. Recreating the memory of Shadow Moses winds up central to the plot itself. Another important contribution to the series by MGS2 was the emphasis on replays. Each difficulty setting in MGS2 features major differences. There are also several unlockable in-game items, and the Byzantinian plot will probably take multiple playthroughs to digest. All of these features exemplify the ways in which MGS2 deceptively and ironically sets out to deviate from any sort of Hollywood model for storytelling.
The battery on these nanomachines will run out soon. They won't be able to follow us.
I guess we won't meet again.
Much like MGS1, Sons of Liberty was intended to be the final game in the series. But the success of MGS2 brought KCE Japan and Hideo Kojima back for the third Metal Gear Solid, Snake Eater. Snake Eater would yet again flip the franchise script. It was a prequel set at the height of the Cold War. MGS3 brought the production values and attention to detail of MGS2 even further. It would also continue Sons of Liberty's interest in sequels, series orthodoxy, and information control. The thematic word for MGS1 had been gene. Much of the game had been about genetics, but also the passing down of things from one generation to the next.
You mustn't allow yourself to be chained to fate, to be ruled by your genes. Humans can choose the type of life they want to live. The important thing is that you choose life, and then live.
The central theme word for MGS2 had been meme, things that are passed down other than genetic information, such as, for example, the sequel paradigm of Hollywood.
Music, literature and movies, what we've seen, heard, felt, anger, joy and sorrow. These are the things I will pass on.
For MGS3, that theme word would be seen.